Welcome back for another video. Today I wanted to cover the story of the Salem witch trials. Hopefully this will be a longer video. I feel like every time I do a video, I plan it and it looks like it's going to be really long, and then I actually sit to film it and it's like 10 minutes long. So hopefully this one will be a bit longer. I would like to start doing some longer videos, not just sort of between 10 and 20 minutes, just something a bit longer than that. So yeah, hopefully this will be that video. I wanted to cover this story for a few reasons. The first time I came across the story of the Salem witch trials was all the way back at school, a very long time ago now, in one of our English lessons where we had to cover different books, and one of the books we covered was The Crucible, which is a fictionalised, to an extent, story cover of the Salem witch trials, and I've been really interested in it ever since. They also did a film called The Crucible based on the book The Crucible, or the play, and I love that film as well. I'm an ex-film student, graduate film student, so I love my films, and that's one of the films I really love. Lastly, the other reason I wanted to cover this is I'll actually be visiting Salem later on this year on a solo trip, and I'm so excited. So I was debating leaving doing this until I've actually been to Salem, but I thought I can't stop watching vlogs at the minute on Salem in preparation for going there, so I just had to do this video. I've been too excited. So the Salem witch trials primarily took place in Salem Village, which is now known as Danvers, and then also in Salem town itself. Salem, Massachusetts is a coastal city filled with history on the North Shore of Essex County, and it's approximately 16 miles north of Boston. If I look down a lot, by the way, I'm trying to get out of the habit of doing that, but the looking down, I feel like I can't retain a sentence for very long, so I'm having to keep looking down just to make sure I'm not mixing up any of my notes that I've made for this. So the trials took place in 17th century Puritan New England, I think I'm saying that correctly, Puritan, during the colonial American period. The trials took place at a time where there was a lot of really widespread fear around witchcraft across Europe and America. At the time, Salem was a deeply Puritan community, which is a really strict Protestant religious group. They believed in wanting to purify the Church of England of practices that they believed were too similar to Catholicism. So they essentially believed that communities had to remain pure to avoid God's punishment or God's wrath. Their daily lives were led very strictly by the Bible and its teachings. They believed in discipline and strict morals. They also viewed sin and the devil as being very genuine, legitimate threats. All of this meant that their lives really heavily revolved around prayer, religion, obedience, and hard work. They also believed that God and Satan were both actively influencing the world, and that the devil could recruit witches to carry out his evil deeds and harm people around them. So essentially, in their eyes, in the Puritan communities, society had to remain pure to stay in God's good books, basically. Many of the day-to-day inconveniences we have in life that nowadays we wouldn't really read into or think anything of, back then could have been considered very possible evidence of witchcraft at the time. So that's things such as illnesses, if you became ill or anyone around you became ill, bad harvests with the crops, death, and any sort of strange behaviour really fell under that. Also, as a bit of a side note, I've heard this quite a lot, that if someone was considered to be a herbal healer, for example, which I guess nowadays would look upon that quite favourably, like someone in the community when medicine wasn't like what it's like today, if there was someone that was trying to heal through natural remedies, I think of that person as a nice person, but they were definitely at risk, I would say, of being accused of being a witch or dabbling in witchcraft. And that actually reminds me of a bit of a mini documentary that we had to do for my degree that was actually about a local witchcraft trial near to where I am, and there was a couple of reasons that the women involved were accused, but that was one of the ones that came up as well. And I just thought I'd mention that because I just think that's quite interesting. Something that now we wouldn't think anything bad of. If anything, you'd think something is a positive thing. Back then, in those times, could absolutely have been a death warrant, basically. So I just wanted to clarify that whilst I'm going through the story of the Salem witchcraft trials, I am going to try and stick to historical facts as much as possible. There's some things that we don't know for definite, and I'll clarify when that's the case, but I will draw some comparisons to what was shown in the play and in the film, just so you can sort of see what differs between what actually happened and what was portrayed in the play and in the book. So our story begins when two girls in Salem Village, which were Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, started experiencing apparently unexplainable fits and convulsions. They would scream and they would exhibit what would be described as strange behaviour. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, there are many things at the time that could be considered as strange behaviour that now we wouldn't look at as strange behaviour, so it's hard to say 100% what what they were counting as a strange behaviour, whether we would agree with that today, but that's what I found. So back to the story. Betty was approximately 9 years old in 1692. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Parris and Samuel Parris, who was the local minister in the village, and she lived in the minister's house in Salem village. Abigail, we think, was around 11 or 12 years old at that time, although we don't know for definite what her age was. We just know from the records that she was a little bit older than Betty was. So Abigail, just for those of you that have seen the film, for example, she is a lot younger than she was portrayed as being in the film. I think in the film she was supposed to be around 17, and in real life, when Winona Ryder was playing that character, she was around 25, so a lot older, and I think that was intentional. So just bear in mind, in real life she was a lot younger, she was a child. Abigail was often described as being a relative of Samuel Parris as well, so she was in some way related to Betty and Samuel and Elizabeth in the story, although we don't know exactly how she was related. We don't know if she was maybe a niece or a close cousin of Samuel, and she also lived in their household as well, so they all lived under one roof. Of the two girls, Betty was the first one to show the afflicted symptoms. Since Betty and Abigail began exhibiting symptoms of affliction, the household became really alarmed, and Parris actually sought medical explanation from a local doctor called William Griggs, who was unable to find a physical cause. So without any medical explanation, just given context to the time they were living in, the kind of society they were living in, the attention shifted very quickly to supernatural causes, which unlike today would have been seen as a very real possibility. So in light of this panic and suspicion, people started to question if someone was harming the girls and if it could be a result of witchcraft. To investigate the situation further, local magistrates were brought in. These were a gentleman called John Hawthorne, I don't know. He was a magistrate and judge, and there was also a gentleman called Jonathan Corwin, who was a magistrate. I never know if I say that word correctly. I say it different every time. Magistrate, one of those. Unlike the book and the film, it's not 100% certain if the girls themselves were the ones that actually started naming suspects or if it was the people around them. But as soon as someone did start naming names, 3 names became very, very early targets. This was Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne and Tituba, and they were all accused in February 1692. So I wanted to talk a bit more first about Tituba, who was one of the 3 women that was named as one of the early suspects. She was a part of the Parris household. Her exact age is unknown, however she was likely an older woman, which I found that offensive when I read that part, because I think she was my age. I wouldn't consider myself to be an older woman, but I suppose that lifespans at the time would have been a lot lower, so I'd have been considered an older woman. So yeah, she was expected to be in her 30s or older, something like that, in 1692, but it really is just an approximate, and we don't know for definite how old she was. So she was sadly an enslaved woman who was brought to New England from the Caribbean. They think, but they don't know for definite, that it was more than likely Barbados where she was brought from. And sadly, she was brought to the household as a slave by Samuel Parris, somewhere between 1680 and 1689, but again, the exact date is unknown. She would work in domestic roles for Parris, such as carrying out tasks like cooking, cleaning and childcare. As a slave, she was not a free member of the family and would have been seen as both useful and a social outsider within the Puritan community. She was also associated with foreign beliefs and folklore from the Caribbean, although there was no evidence of her being seen as a witch prior to 1692. However, all of those things, when you take into context the kind of beliefs at the time, it did mean that she was sort of immediately heightened in her vulnerability of being accused of witchcraft for those reasons. So as I mentioned, there was also 2 other women that were accused alongside Tituba. The first was Sarah Good, who was a poor woman in the village, socially outcasted and often viewed as quite troublesome by the community. She didn't fit in with the Puritan expectations of being respectable, which also made her stand out as quite an easy target. The other lady was called Sarah Osborne, an older woman from the village who was said to have withdrawn from church life, and then as a result of that being considered socially and religiously non-conforming, it was also easier to attach suspicion to her. After the first 3 women were accused, there was a huge increase in anxiety in Salem village, which likely encouraged more signs of witchcraft to be found, as people would have been on really high alert, and that in itself reinforced a pattern of suspicion against people that were already kind of outside or on the margins of society. So basically, if you didn't fit in 100% with the community's expectations, there was not only a very good but actually a very likely chance you could be accused. So all 3 accused women were then brought before the authorities, and they were interrogated as part of the first wave of official examinations in March 1692. This would have involved them being brought before the authorities, ministers and community leaders, and that's because, unlike today, or at least from someone in the UK, my perspective, I don't know how different it is maybe in America, but unlike my experience of today, back then church and law were both very heavily intertwined with one another, so it wouldn't be strange to have religious figures and law people there at the same time. They'd have both been interrogating you, and that would have been quite normal. It's likely that during these examinations that they would have been intimidated by male authorities and put under pressure to tell the truth in fear of violence. And this is where people start to get quite pissed off at the girls in this story, which is definitely depicted a lot more dramatically in the book and in the film, but it is true in real life that Abigail and Betty were both present during the hearings, and they were said to have had really dramatic reactions when the accused women were near them, such as fainting, screaming, having fits, which all would have been considered as further evidence against them. So obviously in terms of the girls, it's hard to have any sympathy. I mean, I do appreciate they were kids. They were definitely kids. I can't say I told the truth as a kid, and a bit of attention. Kids lap it up sometimes and imaginations run wild, but it's really messy. Obviously, I want to blame the adults in this situation for just, regardless of their beliefs at the time, like surely having kids, you know what kids can be like sometimes, and just feeding into that is odd. Yeah, but I thought it was quite shocking to find out that in real life the girls really were active in this whole examination in that sense. So under fear of punishment, Tituba ended up confessing to witchcraft, performing it and working for the devil. This was seen as an immediate confirmation of witchcraft being performed and being very real and alive in Salem. This is something that at the time would have been taken very, very seriously by the authorities that were examining the women, and it opened the door for even more accusations to come in. And the authorities basically believed that they were dealing with a network of witches in Salem. As a result of this, more and more people inevitably were accused in the village, and the next to be accused was a lady called Martha Corey. She was accused of witchcraft in April of 1692, the same year. Interestingly though, unlike the first three women that were accused, she was actually a church member in good standing in the village. So her being accused did actually shock a lot of people at the time because she was so respected in the community. So even though they wouldn't deny it, they would still be open to believing that anyone could be affected by witchcraft. It was still kind of a shock that so quickly after the first three women, it was someone that was actually seen as someone that followed church life and expectations. After Martha, it was a lady called Rebecca Nurse that was accused around the same time in April of 1692. She was an elderly woman, she was very highly respected, and she was very deeply religious. So her accusation also caused some outrage and disbelief amongst a lot of the townspeople at the time. Next to be accused was Giles Corey, who was the husband of accused Martha Corey. He was also accused of witchcraft somewhere between April and May of 1692 after refusing to enter a plea in court, and had probably one of the most infamous deaths in this case, which I will be elaborating on later on. So following that second wave of accusations, fear and panic really peaked in the community in Salem, as it became really clear that anyone could be suspected, and it was not only the people considered to be outsiders that were being accused. And by May of 1692, many more were being accused and arrested, including men and respected members of the community, which led to a rapid population rise in the local prisons. I mentioned the fact that men were accused as well because I think everyone sort of understands the stigma attached to witchcraft. I'm not saying men haven't been obviously accused, but a lot of the time it seems to be aimed at women. It's women that are usually accused. It kind of stood out, I think, to people at the time that men were actually being accused as well, which just goes outside the norm of what you would normally expect to happen. Then in June of 1692, another woman was accused by the name of Bridget Bishop. She was a tavern owner in Salem town, and she was known for being outspoken and very independent, which would have ruffled some feathers back then. Even the fact that she was independent kind of didn't fit what was expected of women at the time, and being outspoken as a woman was definitely a big no-no back then. Interestingly, she had a reputation for having disputes with her neighbours, and she had actually been accused of witchcraft at some point in the past as well, prior to the Salem witchcraft trials, so that definitely didn't bode well for her. After Bridget Bishop, there was then a very shocking accusation made around early to mid 1692 when George Burroughs was accused. He was a former Puritan minister who had once served in Maines, which at the time was a part of Massachusetts. This included claims that he led witch gatherings to use supernatural powers to harm other people. He had had conflicts with other parishioners and as a result was seen as a bit of an outsider. However, his position as a minister made the accusation very, very shocking at the time. The reason for that is, although at the time it was not formally, in the eyes of the law, considered impossible for a minister to be corrupted by the devil, there was sort of a cultural assumption that a minister would be spiritually protected by God, because I guess in some way it would be seen if you're a minister you're kind of closer to God than the average person. So even though it wasn't considered entirely impossible for him to be involved in witchcraft, it would still be very dramatic and unexpected, and as a result everyone was quite shocked by that accusation. This would have been very panic-inducing for the community, as it kind of implied that the devil was attacking even the most godliest of people in their society. So it really meant that essentially no one was safe, whether that was from being falsely accused or actually being corrupted by the devil. The next person I wanted to talk about is John Proctor. In light of the book and the film The Crucible, it would be wrong not to mention him because he's a very key role in both of these. It's very much worth noting, and I did want to point out, that the romantic relationship that was depicted between John Proctor and Abigail Williams in The Crucible is entirely fictional as far as we know. One, there was a very, very large age gap. John was between 59 and 60 years old, whereas, like I say, Abigail was 11 to 12 years old, so that alone would be horrendous, and there's no evidence at all to suspect that they ever actually did have any kind of romantic connection between each other. There's also no evidence that they even knew each other before the trials, so I think it's very widely accepted that that was just a depiction for The Crucible, not for the real life story. John himself was a wealthy farmer and also a tavern keeper in the village. He lived with his wife Elizabeth Proctor, and he was known for being very strong, outspoken, and sometimes confrontational if he needed to be. So he was not a part of the first wave of accusations that happened in Salem, but he became involved in the hysteria after his wife Elizabeth Proctor was accused later on. He very openly criticised the trials and the behaviour of the accusers, which made him a bit of a target himself. So as is accurately depicted in The Crucible, Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor's wife, even though she was accused of witchcraft and imprisoned, she did actually survive the witchcraft trial hysteria, and that's because she was pregnant at the time, and you were protected by law even then if you were pregnant from being executed, and that's what was known as a stay of execution. As far as I understand, it does mean that they could execute someone after they'd given birth, but they were definitely protected whilst they were carrying a child. So John himself was arrested in April of 1692 after being accused by the girls, including Abigail, who said his spectre had appeared in their dreams and tormented them. They accused Elizabeth Proctor, like we mentioned, of drinking blood, and he was tried during the height of the trials. So going back to the people that we've discussed so far in the story, Tituba had been kept in prison as a witness rather than being executed. Her enslaver, Samuel Parris, did not want to pay for her jail fees at the time or keep supporting her imprisonment. At that time, it was actually common for enslavers to abandon or transfer the responsibility for imprisoned slaves rather than continue paying for the costs, which is just crazy even speaking about a living human being like that. As a result of that, Tituba was actually released from prison, although it's not 100% certain on what actually happened to her after her release from prison, although it is believed that she was most likely sold again or transferred to another enslaver outside of Salem. After this point, she disappears completely from historical records, so although there is no solid evidence that she was specifically sold elsewhere into the slave trade, there's also no evidence of her freedom either. There's also no death records or any records of her later life, so historians do assume she was sold back into the trade, but we don't know for definite. Sarah Osborne, one of the other of the three women that was originally accused, sadly died in prison on the 10th of May 1692. She never had the opportunity to successfully defend herself, and she died of natural causes before her trial had concluded. Bridget Bishop was partially convicted on the basis of there being spectral evidence against her, so no physical evidence at all. It was just based on the alleged visions and sensations and the testimony of the accusers. And shockingly today, obviously back then it wouldn't have been shocking, but that kind of evidence was definitely accepted by the court in many of the convictions. As a result, she was one of the next to be executed by hanging on the 10th of June. Sarah Good was sadly executed on the 19th of July 1692 by hanging. Rebecca Nurse, she was initially acquitted due to her strong reputation as a church member, and the jury was initially hesitant due to strong character evidence to find her guilty, but sadly she was then later convicted due to pressure from the court, the ongoing hysteria and renewed spectral testimony. So again, just people's word against her. She was then hung on the 19th of July. Martha Corey, this is quite interesting. So she was convicted when her denial of being a witch was interpreted as proof of her guilt, and sadly was hung on the 22nd of September 1692. And I just think that is such a crazy one. They're all crazy, but this one, it's like, it goes to show how much you literally couldn't win. George Burroughs, who was the minister that was accused, he was then executed by hanging on the 19th of August, along with John Proctor, who was actually hung on the same day. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most infamous deaths was that of Giles Corey. He was actually sentenced to death by pressing, which is heavy stones being placed on him, which is accurately depicted in the film. And he was executed via that method on the 19th of September. Now, there's a bit of a interesting story as well that goes along with Giles Corey. So he had actually refused to enter a plea. So to my understanding, he refused to plead guilty or innocent, I guess kind of out of defiance to the whole situation, which fair play to him. He stood completely mute in court, he wouldn't utter a word to them, and that prevented a trial verdict. And pressing someone was a really brutal legal practice used in English law at the time to essentially try to force a plea out of someone to unblock the legal proceedings against him. So I hope that makes sense, because it took me a minute to get my head around that when I was researching. But yeah, basically he was blocking the court from being able to try him effectively, so there was a punishment for that, to try and get you to speak. It's just kind of crazy. But despite this, Giles never gave in after days of what would have been torture. In the Crucible film, I can't remember if it's in the play as well, but definitely in the film, it depicts Giles as saying more weight when they keep kind of interrogating him whilst they're putting the stones on him. And I just think, even though there's no historical backing to him having said that at the time, I'm glad they did add that into the film, because it shows the mental strength that he definitely did have in the real story, of not giving in to give them what they wanted. He obviously had a lot of strength to go through that and still not give in. He stood by his own convictions, and yeah, even if he didn't say that in real life, I'm glad they did depict him that way, because I think that's still very true to what the kind of person that he sounds like he really was. In total, 20 people were executed during the Salem witch trials in 1692. That included 19 people that were hung and one that was pressed to death, Giles Corey. Most of the victims were executed at Gallows Hill in Salem. It's just something about that name, Gallows Hill. I suppose, like, do you call it the gallows, I think, don't you, with like an area where people are executed by hanging, and I just think it's so ominous. I need to have a look though to see if that's still a place that you can go to for when I visit Salem, because I'm going to try and film whilst I'm there and get to all the major historical landmarks if I can. So the aftermath of the Salem witchcraft trials is by late 1692, ministers and officials began to question the use of spectral evidence in the trials. So that's where there's no physical proof whatsoever, it's just one person's word against another. And for some, the penny began to drop that people were being convicted on non-physical evidence alone. You just had to be accused verbally by someone of being seen in someone's dreams or any of the crazy stuff that they were accused of, and that was enough to get people executed. It's crazy. Governor Sir William Phips started to lose confidence in the process, and the special court, which I don't know if I can say this, but I think it's called the Court of Oya and Termina Oya. I have no idea. I'll put it on the screen. I don't know how you say it. But that court itself was disbanded and no more executions took place, thankfully, after September of 1692. A new court began reviewing the remaining cases, and many of the people that had been accused that hadn't been executed yet were either released, pardoned, or had their convictions overturned completely. But what's crazy is families of those people often still had to pay the jail fees to secure their release, which is just like, what the hell? Like, if you've been acquitted, if you've been cleared, your name's been cleared, you're an innocent person, which I'm sure everyone was in this situation, but for those people that were acquitted and released, the fact you have to pay to be released is crazy. You've been falsely accused of something. Then by 1693, the prosecutions were effectively ended by the colonial government, as the trials were declared to be unlawful, thankfully. And interestingly, some of the victims' families, the people that were actually accused and executed, their families received financial compensation, and some of them had their names officially cleared. Thankfully, it's owed to them. So what happened to the accusers and the people behind all this hysteria and the wrongful killings of all these people? Samuel Parris became deeply unpopular in the village after his role in the accusations and trials, rightly so. He was blamed by many for encouraging the trials, and he was removed from his position in 1697. Which I think is a bit too little too late. Like, this all happened in 1692/1693. Like, how did he get more than an extra day in his job? What a terrible person. And interestingly as well, that's where I think the film definitely gets him spot on. He's definitely not a likeable character in the film, and I think there's even parts where he gets accused of accusing his neighbours. Oh, this might be another man in the film, but basically a lot of the people that are stirring the pot are accused in the film of just getting their neighbours done for witchcraft so that they can then take their property and their land, which it wouldn't even surprise me if that was what happened. After losing his position, Samuel Parris then left Salem, and allegedly he struggled to find a stable ministry job afterward, which karma at its finest. So Betty, one of the first girls that was allegedly afflicted, her symptoms and public involvement in the trials did largely fade from memory, and she is said to have gone on to live a very quiet life and had a family of her own, and there is no record of her ever being formally punished or prosecuted. which I don't know how I feel about that, but yeah. Abigail then disappears from records completely shortly after 1692, which is crazy. And it's unknown what became of her life after the trials, including if she married or when she passed away. Many of the other afflicted girls obviously stopped showing any symptoms once the trials had ended, because nothing was happening to them, and they just returned to normal life as before. Some of them did face criticism and guilt in the community, rightly so, but again, none of them were actually formally punished. Would be interested to hear what other people think about this, because obviously you have to try and put yourself in the shoes of living in a time that is completely different to the life that we all know now and the freedoms that we have. And yeah, it's just, I don't know how I feel about the girls, because I'm like, one, they are very young, and like I said earlier, kids do have imaginations that run wild, and ultimately I think the book stops with the adults in this situation. They should know when to draw a line between the kids just making stuff up for attention and there actually being a risk to them. I appreciate they did genuinely believe that witchcraft and the devil was all a very real risk at the time, but just think, even then, even if that's what you believe, surely you know your own kids enough to know when they're just full of it and when they're not. I don't know. But I do think it is wrong when you think, regardless of whether the kids were just being kids and it's, you know, they were being dramatic, looking for attention because they were living, maybe they were very bored in their lives, they wanted that attention. Still, I think at the end of the day, people died as a result of that, and, you know, I'm glad in some way Samuel Parris got some kind of comeuppance for what he did, but not really. You know, people lost their lives in this situation, and the fact that, by the sounds of it, pretty much everyone that was behind that got off scot-free doesn't seem fair. So that's why we talk about this story now and remember what the people did. This is the punishment, being remembered in the history books as being terrible, terrible people. So yeah, that's kind of my summation of what happened with the Salem witchcraft trials. I do find it really fascinating just because so many people were targeted and lost their lives as a result of what is just basically a group of kids with big imaginations, and it's really sad as well, but it's definitely a story that has lived on for a very long time. People are still very intrigued by it, and I am so excited to go to Salem and see a lot of these big famous historical landmarks and areas. And like I say, I'm hoping I'll be able to film most of it. Just so excited. So yeah, I wanted to do this video very much in advance because it's still quite a while until I go. It's literally the end of the year, but yeah, really looking forward to it, and I just wanted a bit of a refresher of the story, and maybe there's someone out there watching that hasn't heard of the Salem witchcraft trials. Now you know what it is, what happened. And yeah, please let me know your thoughts. Hopefully you enjoyed this story. Hopefully this video is a bit longer, as I've planned for it to be longer than 10 minutes, but we'll see. So hopefully see you in the next video.